Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into the hidden continuity of censorship, how the tools used to silence people in the past are still being used today, just with shinier packaging. Let's start with something provocative. What if I told you that big tech deplatforming someone today is not fundamentally different from the church banning a heretical text in the 15th century? What if I told you that what we call content moderation now used to be called book burning? You see, censorship is not a glitch in the system. It is the system. Whenever there's power, real power, there's a deep, almost instinctive urge to control the story. Because if you control the story, you control how people think. And if you control how they think, well, then you don't need chains or walls. The prison is in the mind. Today, we worry about things like YouTube demonetization, shadow bans on social media, or having our posts flagged by independent fact-checkers. But let's be honest, that's just the modern gloss on an ancient instinct. Whether it's AI filtering your speech or a government licensing press operations, the logic is the same: silence the dangerous, the disruptive, the unpredictable. And what makes something dangerous? Simple. It's usually something powerful people can't control, or worse, can't refute. This video is going to take us through a journey across empires, ideologies, and platforms. We're going to examine how censorship played out in religious wars, in absolute monarchies, under totalitarian regimes, and yes, even in the so-called free democracies. We'll move from the invention of the printing press, to Enlightenment-era book bans, to Cold War media manipulation, all the way to social media takedowns and algorithmic suppression in the digital age. Why does this matter? Because history shows a pattern. Again and again, those in power rewrite the rules of speech, not because they fear lies, but because they fear truths they can't manage. And as our technology evolves, so does the sophistication of censorship, but not its intent. The quote on this slide says it best: "We fear what we can't control, so we silence it." Think about that as we go forward. The faces change, the tools change, but the fear stays the same. Let's take a closer look at what censorship actually is, beyond the surface-level definitions. Alright, so before we go charging through the centuries, we need to pause and ask a deceptively simple question. What actually is censorship? Because it's not just book burning. It's not just some official with a red stamp crossing out lines in a manuscript. Censorship is broader and sneakier than that. At its core, censorship is any deliberate attempt to limit what people can say, read, write, hear, or even think. And it comes in two major flavors: legal censorship and informal censorship. Legal censorship is the obvious one. It's when a government directly outlaws a book, bans a film, imprisons a journalist, or shuts down a printing press. We're talking laws, fines, jail time, maybe even exile or execution. That's the brute force version. And it's been used throughout history, from ancient empires to modern authoritarian states. But informal censorship? That's where things get more subtle and more dangerous. Informal censorship happens when private forces, corporations, mobs, or even public opinion do the job of silencing without needing to pass a law. Think about cancel culture. Think about shadow banning, where your content still exists, but no one can find it. Think about platforms tweaking algorithms so that certain ideas just quietly disappear. No one knocks on your door. No one burns your book. They just erase you from the feed. And across time, the tools have changed, but the methods are hauntingly consistent. In the ancient world, they burned scrolls. In the medieval period, you needed a license from the church to print anything. In the Enlightenment, they threw philosophers in jail for owning the wrong books. In the 20th century, it was blacklists, loyalty oaths, propaganda machines. And today, it's terms of service violations, content moderation policies, and demonetization notices with no explanation. Sometimes it's loud and violent. Sometimes it's quiet and bureaucratic. But the goal is always the same: reduce the circulation of ideas that challenge those in power. And here's a fun historical contrast. On one side of this slide, you've got a modern-day content policy from a tech company, full of vague phrases like harmful misinformation and violations of community standards. On the other side, an ancient decree banning the writings of someone like Galileo or Voltaire. Different words, same impulse. So as we keep going, remember, censorship isn't just the dramatic stuff from dystopian novels. It's often invisible, it's often justified, and it often hides behind good intentions. Next, let's look at the moment that really kicked off the information revolution, and the panic that followed. If there's one invention that flipped the world upside down, it wasn't the steam engine, or the internet, or even electricity. It was the printing press. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg developed a revolutionary way to reproduce text. Movable type, reusable letters, mass production. What had once taken monks years to copy by hand could now be printed in days. And just like that, the gatekeeping of knowledge started to collapse. Until this point, the church, particularly the Catholic Church, had an effective monopoly on information. They controlled which texts were allowed, who could read them, and what the truth was. Latin Bibles, theological commentaries, official histories, all carefully managed. Literacy itself was a privilege, reserved for the clergy, scholars, and the elite. But with Gutenberg's invention, that monopoly cracked wide open. Suddenly, people could access ideas that weren't filtered through religious or royal authority. They could read for themselves, question for themselves, think for themselves. And the ruling powers? They panicked. The press didn't just spread information, it spread dangerous information. Like what, you ask? How about Martin Luther's 95 Theses, calling out the church's corruption? Or Copernicus' heliocentric model, suggesting the Earth wasn't the center of the universe? These weren't just new ideas. They were existential threats to the old order. So, what did the church do? They created the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of prohibited books, a running list of texts so dangerous, so heretical, that simply owning them could get you excommunicated, or worse. It wasn't just a list, it was a warning: you're allowed to know only what we permit. Visualize this, a copy of that index with blood-red redactions, thick black lines across entire pages. Knowledge, literally blacked out. And while the church scrambled to shut things down, the presses kept rolling. The new tech was like wildfire, spreading across Europe in just a few decades. Cities like Venice, Nuremberg, and Basel became publishing hubs. Ideas were being copied, translated, and smuggled faster than the censors could react. This was the dawn of mass literacy, not just the ability to read, but the freedom to read what you chose. And just like that, the old information pyramid began to collapse. The printing press didn't just make books, it made revolutionaries. Coming up next, we'll see exactly what happens when banned ideas don't die quietly, but explode into rebellion. Now, let's talk about what happens when the censors lose control of the narrative. Picture it. The early 16th century, a German monk named Martin Luther nails a document to the door of a church in Wittenberg. Just 95 points. A theological debate, he thought. Some concerns about corruption, indulgences, and the behavior of certain church officials. But thanks to the printing press, that document, the 95 Theses, spread like wildfire. Within weeks, copies were circulating across Germany. Within months, they reached the rest of Europe. This wasn't just a critique anymore. It was a movement, and that movement was unstoppable. Luther's writings were everywhere: tracts, sermons, pamphlets, even illustrated broadsheets. Imagine the early internet, but fueled by ink and outrage. He wasn't the only voice, either. Reformers across the continent began writing and publishing their own criticisms, interpretations, and calls for change. The church tried to clamp down. They labeled the materials heretical. They arrested printers. They banned the texts. But it was too late. The more they banned, the more people read. One Catholic official at the time is said to have muttered, "Printing is the ultimate heretic." And he wasn't wrong. You see, censorship has a funny way of backfiring. When people see a book banned, it doesn't disappear, it becomes forbidden fruit. And when they watch authorities try to silence someone like Luther, it makes them ask, why are they so afraid? The result of all this? 100 years of religious upheaval. Entire kingdoms broke from Rome. Wars erupted across Europe. Millions died in battles not just over land, but over ideas. The Reformation wasn't just a theological dispute, it was a political earthquake, shaking the foundations of who had the right to speak, read, and believe. And it all started with a few pieces of paper, and the attempt to stop them. Now remember, Luther didn't set out to start a war. He tried to start a conversation. But once the tools of censorship clashed with the tools of mass communication, that conversation turned into revolution. Coming up, we'll see how the Enlightenment took this battle of ideas to the next level, and how monarchs and churches tried desperately to keep the lid on a boiling pot. Now we enter the age of reason, or at least, the age when people thought they were finally allowed to think freely. The Enlightenment, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, was a period when philosophers, scientists, and reformers began to openly question authority, religious, political, and economic. They weren't just asking how the world worked. They were asking who got to decide how it worked. Enter names like Voltaire, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. These were not your average academics. They were dangerous minds. Why? Because they dared to say that kings were not divine, that people had natural rights, and that government should answer to reason, not tradition. So how did the monarchs and church authorities respond? Well, you guessed it, with censorship. Voltaire was exiled, repeatedly. His books were banned. His printers were harassed. At one point, he was thrown in the Bastille just for writing satirical poetry. Locke, many of his most important political writings weren't even published until after his death. They were simply too explosive. Rousseau was chased out of country after country, condemned by both civil and religious authorities. And if you think censorship was just about burning books, think again. In France, England, and across Europe, governments enforce strict licensing laws. If you wanted to print a book, you needed official permission, and that permission often came with strings attached. To get around this, an underground publishing scene emerged. Secret presses in basements, smuggled manuscripts sewn into clothing, border towns where Enlightenment text slipped through in hidden crates. It was a cat-and-mouse game between authors and censors, and these weren't fringe pamphlets either. These were the texts that shaped the modern world, books arguing for liberty, social contracts, scientific method, and religious tolerance. Imagine portraits of these thinkers, now famous, stamped with a red band overlay. Their ideas weren't always popular in their own time, but history has a way of vindicating those the censors tried to silence. What's the irony here? The very governments trying to maintain order by suppressing Enlightenment thought were, in many cases, planting the seeds of their own undoing. Because once people start thinking, it's hard to make them stop. Next, we'll see how these ideas collided with action, when revolutions broke out and the cry for free speech became a rallying weapon against the old world order. When the Enlightenment's ideas caught fire, it wasn't just books that burned. Thrones started to tremble. Let's talk about the late 18th century, the era of revolutions. In America, 13 colonies rebelled against a distant empire. In France, a starving populace overthrew a monarchy. But beneath all the flags and speeches and guillotines was something deeper, a demand not just for bread or ballots, but for the right to speak. Free speech wasn't some afterthought. It was a weapon, and one the revolutionaries wielded with precision. In the American Revolution, censorship wasn't just something the British imposed. It was something the founders rejected outright. That's why, after the war, they didn't waste time. The First Amendment, right there at the top of the Bill of Rights, declares that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. This wasn't just a nice idea. It was a radical break from centuries of control. No licensing, no royal approval, no censorship boards. The revolutionaries had seen firsthand how information could be controlled, and they wanted no part of it. Meanwhile, over in France, things were even more intense. As the monarchy collapsed, printing presses exploded with activity. Pamphlets flooded the streets, some praising liberty, others demanding vengeance. Political cartoons mocked the king, the queen, the church. It was raw, chaotic, and often violent. And just like in America, people were willing to die for the right to speak. But here's the twist: in France, many did die because of what they said. During the French Revolution, censorship didn't vanish. It just changed hands. The revolutionary government began executing not just royals, but speech offenders. Say the wrong thing, question the wrong leader, or print the wrong pamphlet, and you could find yourself facing the guillotine. Robespierre, one of the revolution's most infamous figures, once said that terror is nothing other than swift, severe, indomitable justice. And speech? That was often judged as a crime against the people. So even as revolutions declared the right to free expression, they also revealed how fragile that freedom could be, especially when new regimes felt threatened by the very liberty they claimed to uphold. The big takeaway here? Free speech is always part of the revolutionary cry, but it's also the first thing to get silenced when new powers fear dissent. Next, we'll step into the 19th century, where press freedom made major strides, but so did the state's appetite for control. So here we are, the 19th century, a time of revolutions, reform, and rapid expansion of ideas. You might expect this to be the golden age of free speech. After all, liberalism was on the rise. Constitutions were being written, monarchs were losing their grip, and in many ways, speech did break free. Newspapers multiplied, literacy rates soared, political commentary became a staple of everyday life. In places like Britain, France, and the United States, the press evolved from a tool of the elite into a megaphone for the masses. But just as quickly, the backlash began. Because as the press grew bolder, governments grew nervous. Rulers realized that ink could be as dangerous as gunpowder. A headline could stir a riot. An editorial could topple a minister. So, they started to retrench. That's a fancy way of saying they clawed back control. In the United States, even with a strong First Amendment, the government didn't always live up to its ideals. During times of war, especially the Civil War and later World War I, speech was suddenly seen as a threat. That's when we get the infamous Espionage Act of 1917. It allowed the government to imprison people not for spying, but for speaking. Say something critical of the draft, you could be arrested. Print a flyer questioning the war, that's sedition. In Europe, similar patterns emerged. The more liberal the press became, the more states used surveillance, intimidation, and legal threats to keep journalists in check. Police raided newspaper offices. Writers were fined, jailed, or forced into exile. And it wasn't just about big politics. Sometimes, a single article about labor rights or inequality could trigger a wave of suppression. Because when speech touches a nerve, when it threatens the status quo, censorship creeps back in. There's a haunting image on this slide, an old 19th century newspaper with thick black lines through key passages. The ink of free thought, redacted by fear. So even in the age of liberalism, even as democracy took root, the instinct to control the narrative remained strong. Free press was tolerated until it became inconvenient. And as we're about to see in the next chapter, the 20th century would take this instinct to an entirely new level, with tools far more powerful and consequences far more terrifying. Welcome to the 20th century, where censorship wasn't just a tool. It was a system. This is the era of totalitarianism, when entire states reorganized themselves around absolute control, not just of borders and bodies, but of minds. Let's start with Nazi Germany. Under Adolf Hitler, censorship was centralized under a single man, Joseph Goebbels, the Minister of Propaganda. His job wasn't just to block information, it was to manufacture reality. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast, every film had to reinforce the Nazi worldview. Books deemed UN German were rounded up and burned in massive public ceremonies. Entire libraries were erased. Writers were blacklisted. Jewish authors silenced completely. And it wasn't just about erasing ideas. It was about replacing them. Posters, newsreels, schoolbooks, every medium was used to create an alternate universe where the party was infallible, enemies were everywhere, and obedience was truth. But Germany wasn't alone. In the Soviet Union, censorship reached even deeper. The state newspaper, Pravda, which ironically means truth, was the only voice most citizens heard. History itself was rewritten to serve the party. Leaders who fell out of favor were literally erased from photographs. Facts became flexible. Reality became negotiable. And if you were a writer or intellectual in the USSR, you lived on a knife's edge. Say the wrong thing, or fail to say the right thing, and you could find yourself in a labor camp. Or worse, Maoist China took it even further. During the Cultural Revolution, books were destroyed en masse. The Little Red Book became the only text that mattered. Children turned in their own parents for saying the wrong words. Intellectual life didn't just shrink, it evaporated. The past was censored, the present was scripted, the future was unquestionable. Now pause for a moment and think about that. This wasn't censorship as reaction, it was censorship as governance, a deliberate strategy to mold perception from the ground up. Total control of art, language, memory, and identity. And here's the terrifying part. It worked. Millions conformed, millions more remained silent, not because they agreed, but because they were afraid. The lesson from these regimes is chilling. When censorship becomes a full-time operation, when it's institutionalized, weaponized, and glorified, it doesn't just silence speech, it rewrites reality. Coming up next, we'll explore how even so-called free societies found ways to censor, especially when fear was in the air. Now here's where things get uncomfortable, because up until now, we've been talking mostly about monarchies, theocracies, and totalitarian regimes. But what about democracies? What about the so-called free world? Well, during the Cold War, even open societies began to close ranks. Not officially, not always with laws, but with fear, with pressure, with quiet, strategic suppression. Let's start with the United States. In the 1950s, a wave of anti-communist hysteria swept through the country. This wasn't just political, it was cultural. The government launched hearings, blacklists, loyalty oaths. People lost jobs, reputations, and careers not because they committed crimes, but because they knew someone accused of leftist leanings. Some were artists, some were writers, some were just unlucky. The House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held televised inquisitions, demanding people name names. Hollywood was hit hard. Actors, directors, and screenwriters were hauled before Congress. If they refused to testify, they were blacklisted, silenced, not by the government directly, but by studios, sponsors, and fear itself. Now, that's the public face of Cold War censorship. But behind the scenes, things got even murkier. The CIA was running something called Operation Mockingbird. This wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was real. Declassified documents show that the CIA had journalists on its payroll. They influenced media narratives, shaped foreign reporting, and even inserted pro-American propaganda into domestic news. The line between independent journalism and state messaging began to blur. And during the Vietnam War and civil rights movement, dissenting voices were often surveilled, smeared, or suppressed. Take Martin Luther King Jr. The FBI didn't just watch him, they wiretapped him, tried to discredit him, even sent him anonymous letters suggesting he should end his life. All because he dared to speak up in ways that challenged official narratives. Now think about that. In a country that prided itself on the First Amendment, speech was being shaped not just by law, but by surveillance, intimidation, and narrative control. So what do we take from this? Censorship doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a suit and tie. Sometimes it smiles behind a podium. And sometimes it hides behind patriotic slogans like national security or for your own good. Up next, we'll see how the rise of private media giants added a new twist, where censorship didn't come from governments, but from boardrooms. By the late 20th century, the game had changed again. Governments weren't the only ones shaping the narrative anymore. A new player had entered the arena: corporate media. Now, here's the twist: this wasn't censorship through laws or brute force. It was something more polished, and arguably more effective. This was the era when private power took the reins of public discourse. By the 1990s, just 6 corporations owned over 90% of the media consumed in the United States. Think about that. 6 boardrooms, controlling most of what the public sees, hears, and reads. News networks, movie studios, publishing houses, all under the same umbrellas. Suddenly, editorial decisions weren't just about truth or journalistic integrity. They were about ratings, branding, and shareholder value. And that changes everything. Let's say you're a journalist with a story that challenges a powerful advertiser or criticizes a partner company. You might be told, politely, that now's not the right time, or that your editor has concerns, or that the legal team wants to take a second look. And just like that, the story dies. There's no official ban, no government memo, just silence. Deliberate, calculated, sanitized. That's editorial gatekeeping, and it became the new normal. Even headlines began to change. One version for the print edition, another for online clicks, another entirely for social media. Same facts, different framing, depending on what narrative needs to be pushed. And of course, advertisers played a massive role. Entire networks began shaping their content around what wouldn't offend their sponsors. It wasn't about truth. It was about comfort, about keeping the money flowing. This is what makes late 20th century censorship so unique. It's not driven by kings or commissars, but by CEOs, by PR departments, by algorithms designed to keep you watching, not thinking. So while government stepped back in some places, media conglomerates quietly stepped in, offering a kind of soft censorship that didn't look like suppression, but functioned just the same. And the public? Most of them didn't even notice it happening. But change was brewing again. In the next chapter, we'll see how the internet cracked open the gates of speech once more, if only for a moment. The internet, the great equalizer, the digital Wild West, a moment in history when the power of speech was handed back to the people, and no one quite knew what to do with it. Let's rewind to the late 1990s and early 2000s. This was the golden age of online freedom. No gatekeepers, no corporate censors, just open access to the web, an endless frontier of ideas, and a whole generation eager to explore it. Suddenly, anyone could start a blog. Anyone could publish an article. Anyone could challenge the mainstream media, not with a printing press, but with a modem. Forums like Reddit and message boards like 4chan became hubs of unfiltered debate. People argued, people exposed corruption, people made jokes, launched revolutions, and yes, shared some truly awful opinions. But that was the point. Speech wasn't curated. It was free. And then came YouTube. In the beginning, YouTube was pure anarchy in the best way. Homemade videos, raw commentary, creators speaking directly to audiences without middlemen, news analysis, comedy, philosophy, conspiracy, all side by side. It was chaotic, unpredictable, democratic. And this freedom, it wasn't just theoretical. It had real consequences. Look at the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, protesters used social media to organize, to document, and to broadcast their revolutions in real time. YouTube clips of demonstrations, tweets from the front lines, Facebook pages rallying support. It was the first time digital speech directly threatened authoritarian control at scale. And for a brief moment, it felt like the internet had cracked the code. That maybe, just maybe, we had found a way to outmaneuver the censors for good. But here's the thing about freedom: those in power never let it go quietly. This golden era of open discourse wouldn't last. It was too unpredictable, too messy, and too hard to control. Up next, we'll explore how the same platforms that once promised liberation slowly became the new gatekeepers, enforcing silence not with bayonets, but with terms of service. So, the internet gave us freedom, but how long did it last? Not very, because as platforms grew, so did their power. And eventually, the same companies that once promised open discourse started building walls. Not with laws, not with police, but with policies, algorithms, and vague, ever-changing rulebooks that no one really understood. Enter the age of soft censorship. Let's break it down. YouTube demonetization, Twitter bans, Facebook shadow banning, Instagram content review, TikTok takedowns. These aren't just isolated glitches. These are part of a new digital infrastructure, a system that punishes certain kinds of speech, not with jail, but with invisibility. You post a video, gone in an hour. You tweet something controversial, flagged as misinformation. You question a narrative, your reach drops, your views plummet, your followers stop seeing your content. No one tells you why. Instead, you get hit with terms like violates community standards or goes against platform guidelines. Which standards? Whose guidelines? Often, they're intentionally vague, because vagueness gives platforms flexibility. Flexibility to enforce or ignore rules as they see fit. And here's the kicker, none of this violates your constitutional rights. Because these aren't governments, they're private companies. They don't need courts. They have moderators, algorithms, and partnerships with independent fact-checkers. But let's talk about those fact-checkers for a moment. A post gets flagged, a label appears, missing context, false information, disputed claim. Sounds objective, right? But who decides what's true? Who decides what's dangerous? And what happens when those labels become a form of narrative control? In many cases, these independent reviewers are backed by the same institutions that benefit from keeping certain views out of sight. There's no cross-examination, no appeal, just a blur of digital tape over your mouth. What makes this so effective is that it's silent. There's no dramatic moment, just a quiet throttling of your voice. You don't know you've been silenced, only that no one seems to be listening anymore. This is the return of censorship. But now, it's not in the form of burning books or banning authors. It's in the form of code, of shadow policies, of platforms pretending to be neutral referees while shaping the entire game. And just when you thought it couldn't get more Orwellian, along came a global crisis, one that turned this slow drift into a full-blown sprint. Let's talk about what happened during the pandemic. The year is 2020. A virus spreads, borders close, panic sets in. But alongside the medical crisis, another battle begins, a battle over who gets to speak, what gets to be said, and who gets erased. Because during COVID-19, we didn't just witness a public health emergency. We witnessed the rise of real-time censorship. Not after the fact, not years later. Live. Let's be clear, pandemics always bring fear. But this one brought something new, a coordinated, digital response to speech. Suddenly, social media platforms weren't just removing obvious hoaxes, they were actively policing discussion itself. Doctors who questioned lockdowns? Banned. Scientists who raised concerns about vaccine risks? Silenced. Epidemiologists who suggested alternate models? Labeled misinformation. Not later, immediately. And these weren't fringe voices. Many were credentialed experts. Some were even later vindicated. But during the height of the crisis, they were treated as threats, not to health, but to narrative control. What's worse, this wasn't just the platforms acting on their own. Thanks to revelations like the Twitter files, we now know that government agencies were actively coordinating with big tech emails, meetings, flagged accounts. The state didn't need to write new laws, they simply whispered to the platforms, and the platforms acted. A government suggestion became a silent takedown. A flagged post became a deplatformed voice, all in the name of safety. But here's the question, who decides what's safe, what's true, what's dangerous? Because history has shown, again and again, that today's misinformation can become tomorrow's reality. Think about that. Doctors who warned about lab leak theories were laughed off platforms, until mainstream media began taking them seriously. Public health officials who doubted mask mandates were vilified, until policies quietly shifted. Collateral damage? Massive. Public trust shattered. Open debate crippled. What COVID revealed was just how quickly and efficiently modern systems can shut down discussion. No need for trials, no need for public hearings, just real-time deletion, demonetization, and digital exile. And the most chilling part? For many people, this felt normal, even good, because fear had done its job. It made censorship feel like protection. Next, we're stepping into a new frontier, one where reality itself, voice, video, evidence, can be faked, and where that becomes the next excuse to centralize control. Let's talk about AI. Now we step into the future, or at least, the version of the future we used to fear. Artificial intelligence, deepfakes, synthetic voices, digital clones. The tools of storytelling and manipulation have evolved faster than most people can keep up with. At first, AI was seen as a novelty. Chatbots writing poems, image generators making surreal art, funny voices mimicking celebrities. But then came something more powerful, tools that could generate fake people, fake evidence, fake news, instantly. We're not just talking about Photoshop anymore. We're talking about full-blown video forgeries, a politician appearing to say something they never said, a protest that never happened, a confession, a threat, a clip, completely fabricated. And in this environment, truth becomes slippery. How do you prove something's real when the fakes look perfect? And how do you challenge a lie when the tools to spread it are limitless? The response, of course, is predictable. Panic. Governments and institutions are already calling for preemptive censorship. That's right, not banning misinformation after it spreads, but censoring before it happens. Filtering content based on what might be false, what could be harmful, what an algorithm thinks you shouldn't see. This is where the slope gets very steep, very fast. Because now, it's not just about reacting to speech, it's about predicting and preventing it. Using AI to police AI, bot scanning content, labels being slapped on before you even hit publish. And who's behind this movement? It's not just tech platforms anymore. The European Union, the United Nations, major media coalitions, they're all floating proposals for centralized oversight. Digital IDs, verified speech, global fact-checking frameworks run by bureaucracies, not by individuals. Sounds safe, right? But ask yourself, who writes the rules? Who trains the algorithms? Who decides what's disinformation in a world where every dissenting opinion can be labeled dangerous? The rise of AI isn't just a threat to privacy or creativity, it's a threat to authenticity itself. When nothing can be trusted, the easiest thing to do is to ban everything questionable. And once that switch is flipped, we've entered a world where control is automated, constant, and unaccountable. The fear of fakes becomes the justification for silencing truths. And just when you think this battle is about speech alone, we realize it's even bigger. It's about money. Because in the next chapter, we'll see how financial control is quickly becoming the sharpest censorship weapon of all. Alright, up until now, we've talked about speech, what you can say, post, share, or publish. But what if I told you that in the modern world, the most effective way to silence someone isn't to delete their words, it's to cut off their wallet? Welcome to financial censorship, the quiet war on speech through the control of money. Let's start with something that's become increasingly common: debanking. This is when individuals, organizations, or creators are banned from using financial platforms, not because they broke the law, but because someone didn't like what they said. PayPal suspends your account. Stripe closes your store. Patreon freezes your donations. Suddenly, your ability to make a living vanishes. And just like that, you're not censored by words, you're censored by poverty. There's no trial, no due process, just a notice that says you've violated terms of service. That's the catch-all phrase for modern silencing. And who pressures these companies to act? Often, it's a mix of activist campaigns, media outrage, and even behind-the-scenes nudges from governments or regulators. But the real enforcer? Advertisers. Major platforms rely on ad revenue. If an advertiser threatens to pull out because of a controversial voice, the platform has a choice: defend free speech or protect their profits. Guess which one usually wins? So now, speech isn't judged on its merit, it's judged on its marketability. If you're profitable, you're safe. If you're controversial, you're a liability. And this is where the Austrian insight becomes important, not as a slogan, but as a warning. Because when those who control the money can also decide who gets to speak, then economic power becomes narrative power. You don't need secret police. You don't need burning books. You just need a chokehold on the financial rails and a button labeled freeze. There's a quote that fits perfectly here, often attributed to Ludwig von Mises: "Whoever controls the volume of money in any country is absolute master of all industry and commerce." But think one step further. What if that control extends not just to commerce, but to conversation? In this world, speech is still technically free, but expressing it comes with a price. And if you can't pay, your voice disappears. Next, we look at the root conflict behind all of this: centralization versus decentralization. Because that may be the key to understanding whether speech can ever truly be safe again. Now we arrive at the heart of the matter. Beneath all the bans, takedowns, and demonetizations, beneath the headlines, the hashtags, and the hysteria, there is one core question: who controls the system? Because the deeper we go into this history of censorship, the clearer it becomes. The real battle isn't left versus right, or old versus new. It's centralized power versus decentralized freedom. Let's break it down. When media is centralized, whether it's run by kings, governments, corporations, or algorithms, it becomes easy to control. One point of failure, one policy, one phone call, and suddenly, an entire narrative is rewritten or erased. That's how monarchies operated. That's how totalitarian regimes operated. And that's how modern platforms operate. A handful of moderators, a few opaque rules, a central dashboard where someone, somewhere, can silence you with a click. But decentralization? That's different. That's messy. That's chaotic. That's what scares those in power. Because decentralized systems don't ask for permission. They distribute control. They give every node, every person, equal power to speak, share, and decide. And that makes top-down censorship nearly impossible. Let's take an example from history: Gutenberg versus the Church. The Church had a centralized monopoly on religious knowledge, but Gutenberg's press decentralized that power. Suddenly, anyone could print, anyone could read, anyone could question, and the ripple effects changed the world. Now look at today's landscape. On one side, we have Web 2, centralized platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, massive, convenient, and tightly controlled. On the other side, the rise of Web 3, blockchain-based media, decentralized social networks, peer-to-peer file sharing, still rough around the edges, but built on the principle that no one should own the narrative. Even in finance, we see this battle. Central banks and digital currencies versus decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. One is programmable money with surveillance built in. The other is permissionless, borderless, and uncensorable. The stakes are huge, because when systems are centralized, power flows upward, and speech trickles downward. When systems are decentralized, speech starts at the individual and can't be stopped at the top. So ask yourself, what kind of world do we want? One where voices are filtered, ranked, and approved, or one where truth is messy, uncomfortable, and free? Up next, we'll trace the recurring pattern, the reason censorship never truly disappears, no matter the system, no matter the time. So here's the big question: after centuries of revolutions, printing presses, constitutions, and digital platforms, why does censorship keep coming back? Why, no matter the era or ideology, do we see the same reflex: control the narrative, silence the dissenters, punish the outliers? Because power, any power, fears losing control. And the moment people start thinking for themselves, questioning the script, breaking from the herd, that fear kicks in. It doesn't matter if it's a king or a committee, a religious leader or a regulator. The instinct is the same. If speech can inspire rebellion, if ideas can cause unrest, then those ideas must be managed, restricted, sanitized. And here's the twist: it's not just authoritarian regimes that do it. It's left-wing governments, right-wing governments, liberal democracies, theocrats, technocrats. Everyone plays the same game, just with different rules. One era says it's protecting the public from heresy. Another says it's guarding against revolution. Another says it's shielding us from misinformation, hate, disease, terror, or harm. But the result is always the same: a shrinking circle of acceptable thought. Take a look at the collage on this slide. Centuries of excuses, dressed up in different costumes. We're doing this for your safety, for the children, to protect democracy, to stop hate. The slogans change, the logic doesn't, and most people go along with it, not because they love censorship, but because it's framed as necessary, urgent, for the greater good. But when speech is filtered through fear, what gets lost? Perspective, debate, dissent, the friction that drives societies forward. And here's a critical truth: censorship always starts with the unpopular voices. But it never stops there. Once the machinery is in place, once the public gets used to the silence, the circle tightens, the definition of dangerous expands, and eventually, even the mainstream must watch what it says. This is why history matters, because every generation thinks their reason for censorship is different, special, justified. But the pattern is as old as civilization, and if we don't recognize it, we're doomed to repeat it. So let's wrap this up with some final reflections on what censorship truly threatens, and why your voice may be the last line of defense. Here's where we bring it all together, because if there's one thing history teaches us, loud and clear, it's this: the battle for speech is the battle for human agency. You cannot separate freedom of expression from freedom itself. You can't have liberty without disagreement. You can't have progress without uncomfortable ideas. And you definitely can't have truth without the right to question. So ask yourself, who decides what's true? A government? A platform? An algorithm? A committee of experts? Or, for you? Censorship isn't just about deleting a post or banning a book. It's about shaping reality, about drawing the boundaries of thought, about telling you, this is the only version of the world you're allowed to believe. But history shows us that truth doesn't come from the top down. It rises from the ground up, from dissent, from resistance, from the brave and the banned. That's why decentralization matters, not just in tech or finance, but in power. Because when power is concentrated, speech becomes conditional. When it's distributed, speech becomes possible, even when it's messy, even when it's flawed. And that's the point. If we want a future where people can speak freely, think independently, and challenge the script without fear, then we need to remember the past, not just the heroes and victories, but the censorship, the erasures, and the slow, quiet suffocations. Because that's how freedom dies, not with a bang, but with a policy update. If you've made it this far, thank you. You're part of a rare group willing to think deeper, question harder, and learn from history, rather than repeat it. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It helps us reach more people who care about truth and history. And if you want to go even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase, The link is in the description. This is Truth Behind History, where we challenge the official story, one chapter at a time. See you in the next video.